You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio joining you. Going solo today. It's about 5 o'clock on Thursday, January 30th, as we get ready for a important game for Indiana men's basketball as they face Purdue at Purdue tomorrow. A game that on paper doesn't look that ideal for IU. And it's a good time for us to kind of sit down and walk through some of the things that IU basketball is facing as we get ready to turn into February and IU with a really tough slate of games coming up. So we're going to talk about that a little bit on the show. Going to show you some charts and some other items. Been doing this on the Substack in our VIP section. We've been giving our subscribers content like this as we, walk through some of the advanced metrics and talk through what exactly Indiana is struggling with and how they might be able to fix it. If you're not watching this, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or if you're only listening on Spotify, I'll just let you know there is a video component to this that's got some graphs and charts and things like that that we're using. So I'm going to explain everything so you don't have to look, but if you do, go to the YouTube channel or go to Spotify and turn on the video so you can watch along. I mentioned the Substack. Just a reminder, we are on Substack here at Crimson Cast, crimsoncast.substack.com, and you can join a large number of folks who are going to be regularly receiving materials via email. We've had a lot of people who have subbed over the course of the last year and a half. It's free to sign up, and you get the video and the audio sent right to your inbox via email, so you don't have to get on social media and see when we're posting. There's also a paid subscriber option. It's relatively cheap, I think, $5 a month, $50 a year, and it helps to support the podcast. It also allows us to send you some special things that only go to our paying subscribers. So check it out. Go to crimsoncast.substack.com. We'd love to have you as part of the community. We are a proud member of the Back Home Network, and the Back Home Network containing, of course, Assembly Call, the Doing the Work podcast, a bunch of other shows. We're going to be live in Bloomington this upcoming Saturday, not Saturday the 1st, but Saturday the 8th at the Upstairs Pub, as we will be there for the Michigan game. I'll be there during the game, and we'll be talking throughout the course of the game. We did this last year for the IU Penn State game, and it was a lot of fun. We got a chance to see a lot of Back Home Network fans, a lot of people who've been listening to the podcast for a while, and we're excited about that. A big day as we partner with the Upstairs Pub, a show and an event brought to you by Evan Williams, and looking forward to seeing what they bring to the table. They're going to have Breakfast Club in the morning, so if you want to get an early start, they're going to start that at 9 a.m. on Saturday, February 8th, 9 a.m., Breakfast Club. The game happening a little bit later on, and the Breakfast Club going to feed right into the game. I'll be getting there probably around 11:30 or noon, and there's no cover at Upstairs. There's never a cover. First 200 people in the door get a free shirt and breakfast. And again, that's going to be courtesy of Evan Williams. And then during the game, I'll be there talking to folks. We'll break in and talk during the breaks, talk a little about what's going on with the game. And then afterwards, we'll be joined by the Assembly Call crew, at least most of them. Ryan Phillips going to be joining us. Coach Tonsoni going to be joining us as well. We'll have some other folks from the various properties. I think Bob Moats and Mike Weemuth are likely to be there as well. And last year we did this, and then we went and we had a good time and hung out in town. So hopefully you'll be able to join us in Bloomington on February 8th at the Upstairs Pub at our event brought to you by the Upstairs Pub and Evan Williams. We're looking forward to it. We've also, of course, at the Back Home Network, we're brought to you by Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions. And man, did they drop a big one, an awesome product drop today as they unleash. Actually, technically it was yesterday, but some hockey hoodies, including an IU script hockey hoodie with some awesome logos on the sleeves. A really, really exciting look. I'm looking forward to getting my hands on one of those. 30 different hoodies, I think, from teams all across the country. Minnesota, Arizona State, a bunch of different programs that have hockey at some level. So head on over to homefieldapparel.com. You can use the code HOME23 and get 15% off your first order. Again, that's homefieldapparel.com, proud sponsor of the Back Home Network. All right, let's talk about IU basketball as the Hoosiers are in a struggle right now. They've lost 4 of their last 5, and the one win was a 1-point win in overtime against Ohio State. And it feels like we were just coming off a 5-game winning streak for IU, and a lot of people were excited as they sat at 13-3 and really looked like they were in pretty good position if they kept that rate of winning up, that they might be able to integrate themselves into the NCAA tournament picture. They've been kind of bopping along in the bottom third of the bubble picture in terms of being in the field. And right now, I just wanted to show you where things were at, all things considered. We're going to take a look at Bracket Matrix. If you're not familiar with Bracket Matrix, I highly recommend it. It's a great way to see everything that's going on in the college basketball world as it's relating to the NCAA tournament. As the gentleman who maintains the Bracket Matrix, he aggregates all of the brackets being done by experts across the country, not just big media companies like ESPN and CBS, who frankly tend to have brackets that are not great in terms of accuracy, to really accurate brackets like Delphi Bracketology or like Andy Bottom's bracket. So you look at this, and essentially what this does is it looks at the brackets and it evaluates where everybody's got everyone seated, and then it goes in and essentially gives a sense of the people out of the field, like how many teams are being considered versus how many teams are just not on the inside. There is a wisdom of crowds kind of thing that goes on with the bracket, where normally by the time the tournament rolls around, we have a pretty good idea of who all the teams are going to be. It's just the order we're not certain about. And there's a couple of teams on the edge of the bubble that sometimes there's a surprise, but rarely are we surprised by more than 1 or 2 teams being in the field that shouldn't have been or weren't projected to be, and vice versa. So when you look at the bracket matrix right now, it's a little vague, but you get a pretty good sense of the teams that are likely going to be in the field based upon how they've accrued wins so far. So as we look at bracket matrix, pretty clear consensus that the top 4 seeds in the tournament right now, as of January 28th, which is when this was last updated, Auburn, Duke, Alabama, and Iowa State. And I don't think there's really been any results lately that would change that. And you look through, I mean, you have to get down right now, Michigan State and Purdue. Michigan State right around a 3 seed, Purdue in the 3 seed range, Illinois in the 4 seed range, Wisconsin in the 5 seed range, along with Michigan. Where's Indiana in this mix? Well, right now, Indiana, according to Bracket Matrix, consensus not in the field. But they're not as far out as you might think. So if you look at the teams that have been left out of the field in Bracket Matrix, and for those of you watching along, you can see, the team that would be left out right now that most people, the most people have in is Wake Forest. Wake Forest appears in 23 brackets, but not a critical mass to get into the field according to this combination of ratings. Arizona State on 12 brackets, BYU on 7, Xavier on 6, and then Indiana on 5. So, the Hoosiers were, if you go back a ways in the bracket, they were projected for a while there prior to losing 4 out of their last 5. Now they've largely fallen off of the radar for many people, and it's because of just the way they're playing right now. I think what's optimistic, or how I would approach this if I was trying to be optimistic about IU basketball, is that as poorly as Indiana's played lately, they're still not that far away from being in the field. And really right now, their resume is just calling out for the kind of wins that help to distinguish you in terms of trying to be selected for the field. And as much as being 14-7 and 5-5 without a whole lot of tournament caliber victories is not a good place to be, the nice thing for Indiana is they have some opportunities to pick up wins like that over the course of the next couple of months, or at least the next 6 weeks, which is really the time period we're talking about. And that starts this Friday at Purdue. That would be one of the best wins that you would pick up in college basketball. Am I expecting IU to win that game? Not really. Purdue's been playing incredible ball, and Indiana has not. But that's the kind of win that you would need to pick up if you were going to be competitive for a tournament spot. And they've got several of those games on the docket. The road games, like if you look at it right now, Indiana's got 5 road games remaining. And of those 5, 4 of them could be helpful. And even the 5th one would at least show that you could win on the road. Indiana's already got a nice road win. They've really got 2 of them. Penn State, which was a semi-away. It's not a true road game, but it's closer to a road game than a neutral game. So they win at Penn State. They win at Ohio State. And if you've watched or listened to the podcast in the past, you know that the tournament selection committee really values historically showing that you can win away from home and win away from home against teams that are either in the field or have a good chance of being in the field. Penn State's pretty iffy right now. Ohio State, I think, is still in the field at this point. They're going to kind of hover around that, but they've done some good things, including winning at Purdue. And so even though Ohio State right now 4-5 in conference, I still generally think that their chances of making it into the field, could be fairly decent. If you look at the bracket matrix, they are kind of on the fringes of things right now, but they are still technically in the field. They were I think they were maybe the last bye or the last team that didn't have to play in the play-in round in the most recent bracket matrix. So that'll be something to keep an eye on. But Indiana's got an opportunity here. Like they get to go to Purdue. I say get to go to Purdue, like that's something that would be ideal. But with this, that's a game that if you win that, much like Ohio State did, well, now you've really put yourself in a good spot with the committee. They get to follow that up with traveling to Wisconsin. Again, a house of horrors historically for Indiana, at least over the last 20, 25 years, but a win that would absolutely put Indiana back into the field probably overnight. They get to go to Michigan State. Same thing. Again, Michigan State leading the league right now. Very difficult place to play. Indiana's won their, they that weird Archie Miller win that they had up at Michigan State. They beat Michigan State at home last year. And then they get a 3-game homestand before traveling to Washington, which that's not a tournament caliber team, but that would still be a decent road win. That's a top 100 KenPom team. And then at Oregon, who is not invincible, as we've seen. Illinois went in and smacked Oregon around. We saw Oregon lose at Minnesota. Oregon, the blooms come off the rose a little bit there, but that's still a tournament caliber team. That would be a tournament caliber road win. And even the home games for Indiana, you get Michigan at home the day that we're going to be at Upstairs on February 8th. You get UCLA, who's still in the tournament field, I think, at this point, but kind of borderline. Purdue at home, Penn State at home, Ohio State at home. All of those games are going to be helpful in some way if Indiana can win them. And my point in all of this is as off the rails as it feels like this season has gotten to some people, realistically, Indiana is still in the mix for an at-large bid. And this is not me like pumping sunshine at IU. This is just the reality. Like the fact that Indiana has those 2 wins away from home really does make a big difference. And this is not like last year when Indiana just really had if you look at what Indiana's resume was at this time last year, the only win that they had on the 29th or the 30th of January that was notable, in terms of being away from home was the neutral site win against Louisville or the win at Michigan, neither of whom were tournament teams. And so those were barely notable games. Now, Indiana did win at Ohio State. That was February 6th of last year. That was also not a tournament caliber Ohio State team. In Indiana, the big problem last year was that they just didn't have anything close to a road win. What I'm interested in and what I'm excited about is that at least Indiana has done some work that have put them in position where they could compete for a tournament bid. The problem now is that they're going to have to keep pace with other teams that also have similar calibers of wins. Now you're getting into a resume measuring contest, for lack of a better term, in terms of can Indiana do enough work to not just keep pace with where they're at right now, which is probably going to entail finishing at least 10-10 in conference, going 5-5 the rest of the way. But also, can they outpace the other teams that are fighting for those at-large bids? That's going to be the big question mark as we move into the last month and a half of the season, essentially. So we'll keep an eye on that. As we look at some of the metrics and some of the numbers, I want to call some of these up and talk about them. As I mentioned, we've been talking about some of the various aspects of IU's play over the course of the last month on our VIP channel over on Substack. So I'm going to kind of bring that into the mix here for you all as well. So I'm going to call this up on the video file or video screen. We're going to start with Bart Torvik and the T-rank system, which I really enjoy. I'm a big fan of Ken Pom as well, but I really do think that Torvik at this point may have a slightly more reliable rating system in terms of how good teams actually are. So up on the screen right now, you can see Indiana ranked 67th in Torvik, which is not good. They're 62nd in Ken Pom, and I think they're 71st in Haslametrics, which is another site that I really enjoy using. All these sites essentially do similar things. They take the statistics from the games and the statistics that teams have accrued, and they essentially aggregate them, try to evaluate statistically who the best teams are, and then they rank everybody against everybody else. They also look at various performative metrics that teams are getting out of their games. And so we're going to talk about some of those items here. So if you look at IU right now, 67th in the country in Torvik, and the offense has receded, unfortunately. And it's at 70th right now in terms of offensive efficiency adjusted for opponent. Defense has also receded a bit from what we saw earlier on in the year. It's 68th in the country. So that equates out to about 67th in terms of the average of those rankings. You look at the four factors, which we've talked about on this show before, the things that contribute the most to victories based upon statistical analysis. Indiana, kind of a mid-team in terms of effective field goal percentage, which, they're 139th in effective field goal percentage offensively, and they're allowing 49.7% effective field goal percentage, so they're 128th defensively. IU, about middle of the pack in the country in turning the ball over. They turn the ball over on 17.2% of possessions. They are not turning opponents over, which is a thread that we've talked about a lot with this team. They're just not playing that kind of defense where they're forcing a lot of turnovers. IU's offensive rebounding was doing very well. It's fallen back a little bit, but it's still 94th in the country in terms of offensive rebounding percentage. And they're doing an okay job of keeping opponents off the offensive boards. They're 126th in that category. And then free throw rate, Indiana 143rd in the country. So again, kind of in the middle. And then, one thing that Indiana has done really well defensively is they're not sending their opponents to the free throw line very much. And that's kind of the positive trade-off from that turnover percentage number. You're not forcing turnovers, but you're not picking up fouls, so you're not sending the other team to the free throw line that often. Shooting-wise, Indiana's three-point shooting was doing pretty well, and it's fallen way off. It's almost like Luke Goody soaked up everybody's three-point shooting ability, and everybody else is missing it now. It feels like is how it's gone, because Goody has definitely gotten better from three. 2-point percentage-wise, Indiana's doing okay. They're top third in the country at 53%, but that's not really good enough when you take as few threes as Indiana does. And that's the statistic that I'm most worried about. Indiana 333rd in the country in three-point rate. You look at what Indiana's done against opponents, and what's really unfortunate is how Indiana has fallen off against quality opponents from an efficiency perspective, and B, why the fact that Indiana's fallen off in their last 10 games in terms of their efficiency. So I mentioned earlier, like Indiana 70th in the country in offensive efficiency, 68th in the country in defensive efficiency. So those are both top quartile in college basketball, roughly. But against quality opponents, Indiana is 90th in offensive efficiency and 185th in defensive efficiency. So they're not scoring as effectively, and they are not defending well against top-level competition. So if you look at and when we talk about quality opponents, it's top 50 teams. So you look at the numbers. Indiana has played 8 games against top 50 opponents. They're 2-6 in those games, and their effective field goal percentage is 46.7%, which is 155th in the country. They're rebounding on the offensive boards really well in those games, but they are not shooting threes very well against those teams at all. 31.6% from three, and their 3-point rate in those games is at 248th. And so you look at IU against quality opponents, and they're not a whole lot better. Like, if you have to kind of delete some of the smaller, or the teams that haven't played as many games against top 50 opponents. But like South Carolina is about the same as Indiana in terms of overall efficiency against top 50 opponents. And you look at the best teams in the country, these are the teams that we just talked about in terms of seeding. Auburn is best in the country against top 50 opponents. Florida, who's a top 5 team, is right up there. Duke, Houston, Iowa State, Alabama, Tennessee, Marquette. That's your top 8. In the last 10 games, Indiana has receded, and it certainly is playing not nearly as well as they were earlier. So in the last 10 games, Indiana's offensive efficiency is 96th in the country, and their defensive efficiency is 86th in the country. So not as bad as their overall performance against top 50 teams, but still not as good as their performance throughout the course of the season. And for those of you who are watching along, we've got the game score trend, which is essentially an internal metric by Torvik that measures in terms of how well or how poorly a team played in the game. And you can see there's a very steady downward trend for Indiana. They started off relatively strong in terms of game score, and they've had several games here that have fallen below that line, and that's led their overall performance to drop quite a bit in terms of those games. When you look at IU, one of the metrics you want to keep an eye on in terms of their tournament possibilities is what's called wins against bubble. And wins against bubble is essentially a statistic that measures when you win a game or lose a game, how does your overall resume, based upon all the games you've won or lost, how does it look in comparison to other teams in the country, and especially other teams on the bubble. And so it's a little hard to see on the screen here, but I'm going to try to zoom in a little bit. If you look at IU, like IU had accrued some, they'd gotten decent in terms of the fact that by the time they won that the USC game, on the 8th of January, their wins against bubble was 1.4, which is a pretty good spot to be in. It dropped off by essentially half of its value when they lost to Iowa and then lost to Illinois, largely because of the margins in those games. But then they jumped back, winning on the road at Ohio State, jumped it back to 1.4. But now losing at Northwestern, losing at home to Maryland, their wins against bubble is back to 0.5. So this is a metric you want to keep an eye on. They've got a bunch of opportunities to win games that will help their case in terms of their bubble resume. And for those of you who are watching along, like you can see, like the games that have the biggest impact are the Purdue game on the road, the Wisconsin game on the road, the Michigan State game on the road, the Oregon game on the road, and then the Purdue game at home. And then the Michigan game certainly would be a positive factor there too. The reason I would note this is obviously Indiana is not favored in most of those games, but they are favored at home against Penn State. They're favored at Washington, and they're favored at home against Ohio State. Those would help some. But Indiana is going to have to pick up some of the more difficult games, the games they're not favored to win in. That's going to make a big difference in terms of how Indiana's overall resume ends up looking. So these are some things to keep in mind just from a pure numbers perspective as we dive further into this schedule and we see how Indiana fares over these last 10 games of the regular season. The other thing I wanted to note as far as the overall statistics were concerned is how Indiana offensively has been doing. One of the things we talk about a lot in looking at basketball statistics is adjusted efficiency. You've heard me mention it a bunch in this podcast. The reason adjusted efficiency is so important is because scoring, like Indiana, for instance, in the Maryland game, they scored about 1.25 points per possession. And that was really good, but it was even better because if you factor in how good Maryland's defense generally is, it was actually worth about 1.35 points per possession. So that's how it works. It's like you score a point and a quarter against Maryland, that's great, but you're actually doing better if you adjust that for how good Maryland normally plays defense. The problem for Indiana in that game was that their defense let them down. Maryland hits 12 of 24 from three. Maryland scores a point and a quarter per possession themselves, which is, not that abnormal given that Indiana's defense has been pretty mid-level. But that was, if you look at adjusted efficiencies, that was actually Indiana's worst adjusted defensive performance of the entire season. Up to that point, it had been the game at Nebraska, but now it's the game at home versus Maryland. And it came at exactly the wrong time, because that would have been a win that would have really helped Indiana with a bunch of different things. And so something to keep in mind as we move forward is, Indiana has gotten themselves to a point where they really just have to start overperforming in a lot of these games. And you look at the teams that they've got the rest of the way, they all do certain things really well. And, you look at, the Big Ten Conference overall, if you look at their overall efficiencies, Purdue is, they're a pretty good defensive team. They're 24th in the country, but they're 7th in offensive efficiency. That's a really good offensive team in terms of what they've done so far this season. Indiana has got to play really good defense in that game. Wisconsin's actually even more extreme. They're almost as good as Purdue offensively, but Wisconsin's kind of middle of the pack in terms of their defensive efficiency. And so in that game, Indiana's really got to score while also trying to defend Wisconsin. On the flip side, UCLA's offense is not that great, but their defense is pretty good, 55th in offensive efficiency and 20th in defensive efficiency. So this is where Indiana's at this point. And just taking it from that perspective, season's not over. Still a lot of opportunities to do some things if you're Indiana. The tournament's still right there, and you're not that far outside of the bubble, but you're outside of the bubble right now. And you've almost, with the loss to Maryland, you've kind of thrown away what would have been a really nice resume win against a team that probably isn't as good as their record indicates or as good as their overall numbers indicate. Although I will give Maryland credit, they are getting better. They blew out Illinois at Illinois, and then they came home and they beat Wisconsin at home yesterday, I guess it was Wednesday night. So you look at it, and Indiana right now 5-5. Right now, their overall projection in terms of the Big Ten tournament is not good. Indiana right now projected to go 8-12 in conference, which I think would land them 13th in the conference. And there's only going to be 15 teams invited out of the 18 to the Big Ten tournament. So Indiana talking about like a first day selection and having to win 5 games in 5 days in order to get to the title game and win it and get an automatic bid. And you're kind of in this weird spot right now with Indiana where the projection is 8 wins. And we talked about the 3 games that Indiana's favored for, Penn State and Ohio State at home, and then at Washington. You're in the mix with a bunch of other teams. Now, I think Indiana's lucky right now in that there are 3 teams that are clearly worse than them in terms of projected record. Nebraska is projected to go 7-13 in conference. Minnesota is projected to go 6-14, and Washington projected to go 4-16. I feel pretty good, even with the loss to Nebraska that Indiana suffered, that Indiana will likely finish ahead of those 3 teams, since Indiana's already got 2 wins in hand on Minnesota, and they beat them, and they don't have to play them again. So they got the tiebreaker there, and they have 3 games in hand against Nebraska, or at least 3 wins in hand. Now, they did lose to Nebraska, so they would lose that tiebreaker, but now you're talking about the potential of a big tiebreaker with a bunch of different teams involved, which might help Indiana in that mix. But you look at the teams Indiana might be fighting for seeding positioning, and Penn State's going to be in that mix. They're projected to go 8-12. Northwestern's going to be in that mix at 8-12. UCLA's projected at 11-9, but they're also projected to win against Indiana. So if you can nab that game, now you've given yourself a boost in terms of, if you can tie UCLA in the standings, you're going to have the advantage in terms of tiebreaker. So that's from a purely like numbers perspective what Indiana is facing. And it's going to be interesting to see how they fare. Now, one of the things I think is worth noting now, and I'm going to turn the screen back on here to showcase this for you all. So going to KenPom, and we could do this with Torvik too, but I want to give both of these sites some love. One of the things that's notable once you get to about the halfway point of the conference season is this idea of conference-only statistics. So basically taking out the things that are, the games you played against non-conference opponents and just focusing on what Indiana's doing in conference or what all the teams are doing in conference. And so what we see with that, and you can see it on screen here, if you look at offensive efficiency in conference, Michigan State has been the best by far. They've also played one of the weakest schedules, so has Indiana, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. Purdue's been second best in offensive efficiency. Wisconsin's been third. Michigan's been fourth. Iowa's been fifth. Indiana's 10th, which is obviously not as bad as it could be, but that's very middle of the pack. That's almost smack dab in the middle. Indiana's effective field goal percentage in conference has been awful. 48.4%. That's 17th in the conference. Only Washington shooting worse in terms of effective field goal percentage. And shockingly, it's because Indiana's 2-point field goal percentage, which really saved them from like a really embarrassing season last year because it compensated for the lack of threes. Indiana's worst in the conference right now in 2-point field goal percentage at 48.1%. And they're 13th in the country in the conference in 3-point field goal percentage. They're only 14th in the conference in free throw percentage. So the offense is just not clicking. Where they've really benefited is that they haven't turned the ball over and they've been getting a lot of offensive rebounds. And they've been getting to the free throw line a decent amount. So that's kept possessions alive, but Indiana's just not shooting the ball well right now in conference games. And that's a trend I don't know if Indiana's going to be able to fix as they go through the rest of the season. But that's, if you're going to fix things, that's where it's got to start. Defensively, one of the reasons why Michigan State's leading the conference is they've been the best team in terms of conference defensive efficiency. They're first in the conference there. They're first in the conference in an effective field goal percentage. If you look at Indiana, they're 12th in both of those categories. They're 12th in defensive efficiency in conference games, and they're 12th in effective field goal percentage allowed in conference games. And the biggest issues for IU is they're not stealing the ball, so they're not ending possessions early for the opposition, and they're not forcing turnovers, as we mentioned earlier. They're allowing opponents to shoot at basically a 36% clip from three, and they're allowing opponents to shoot 53.8% from two. So the defense just really not getting the job done. And I mean, you look at those two aggregate numbers, Indiana 10th in overall offensive efficiency in the conference, and Indiana 12th in overall defensive conference efficiency. It's no wonder that they are not only in the middle of the Big Ten in terms of the standings right now, but are projected to only go 8-12. These are all fixable items, but they're running out of time to fix them. And I think that's really a concern. And you look at where Indiana's going over the course of these next few games, they're going to have to play, Purdue, who's second in both offensive and defensive efficiency. They're going to have to play Wisconsin, who's third in offense and fifth in defense. They got to play Michigan, who's fourth in offense and seventh in defense. These are all teams that in both areas are ahead of Indiana, and that's going to be a problem. So if there's going to be recovery and if there's going to be a turnaround in terms of the trajectory of Indiana's season, it's really going to have to start with one of those two. I don't know if they can do both, but one of those two areas is going to have to change if you are going to see Indiana coming away with anything worthwhile over the course of the last 6 weeks of the season. One other thing I wanted to note, and I think it's really interesting. It's a nice mapping of things. I'm going to show Eric Haslam's page here, haslametrics.com. And this is going to be the hardest one to try to translate to the folks that are listening as opposed to watching. But if you go to Haslametrics and you look at Indiana, you can see a bunch of different statistics in terms of how they're playing. What you're seeing on screen right now is Indiana's offensive efficiency ranking compared to the rest of the country if you go day by day. And what you see is like Indiana started off the season, and by around Thanksgiving, it stabilized at about the 25th or so, 25th to 30th team in the country in terms of offensive efficiency. That starts to nosedive immediately after they get done playing the two Big Ten games at the beginning of December, and collapses to the point that, by the time they play Iowa in mid-January, their offensive efficiency ranking had dropped all the way to about 110th in the country. Now, they've rebounded some these last few games, and that's been interesting to see. because I was really concerned about the fact that they kept trending down. They have bounced back up. And as we mentioned, they had a really good offensive game against Maryland. They had a decent offensive game, relatively speaking, against Northwestern. And they also had a decent offensive game against Ohio State, actually a relatively good one. So they have rebounded from what was their worst offensive game of the year against Iowa. But I do wonder, how does that trend line go? Do they keep coming up? They're going to have to some degree if Indiana wants a shot at the NCAA tournament. Defensively, the chart, again, it shows Indiana peaks around 25th in around Thanksgiving, drops off a cliff at the end of November, and that was really the effect of Maui. And after coming back and putting in a good defensive performance in that game against Minnesota, dropped right back off a cliff again. And right now, Indiana's defensive efficiency, while it got slightly better in the middle of in the middle of January, has dropped back down into the 80-ish range on Haslam. And, it's funny because the defensive efficiency is starting to go down just as the offensive efficiency is coming up. So that is a concern because you want both of those things to be moving up. You don't want one to fall off while the other one gets better, because then it just kind of looks like you're plugging one hole in the boat and letting water in the other hole in the boat. So we'll see. I mean, I think for IU at this point, one of the things that stands out, and Haslam does a good job of figuring this out. He's got a note for there's a statistic called consistency. And it's essentially how consistently are you playing? Indiana's not very consistent. Indiana is you don't need statistics to tell you that. Indiana bounces all over the place in terms of overall performance, and that's a real concern. And it's why I won't be shocked if Indiana goes out and wins one of these games against a tough opponent and then loses a game that they should win. That's just kind of the way that the season's gone so far. So anyway, that's kind of an overall look at the team numbers. We're not diving into individual numbers tonight, but looking at team numbers, seeing where Indiana's at, and this is what confronts them as they go into Mackey and they try to put themselves in a position where perhaps they, could get into the NCAA tournament. Who knows what happens as far as all this goes? But it's going to be interesting to see as Indiana tries to salvage their season. And at this point, they sit outside the bubble. They've got all of the tools at their disposal to get inside the bubble. The question is, can this team start to row the same way? Can the coaching staff do what they need to be doing to get Indiana into a position where they can get back into the NCAA tournament, which really, I think is worth noting, was the minimum expectation for this season. But at this point, anything beyond that is probably too much to ask for. At the very least, if you get Indiana into the tournament, you've got obviously some talented players. Maybe something happens there. But that's where things are at right now, with Indiana certainly on the outside looking in as of January 30th, but with a lot of opportunities to change that as we move forward. Anyway, that'll wrap it up for this episode of Crimson Cast. I'll be back with more with Scott probably over this weekend. We'll recap what happened in Purdue. We'll preview what happens in the Wisconsin game, and we'll talk about some other items as well. Thanks for joining us here on Crimson Cast. Thank you to our presenting sponsor, Home Field Apparel. Thanks to Evan Williams for sponsoring us on February 8th at the Upstairs Pub. We'll see you folks there. Catch you on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.